I need you to stop scrolling for exactly 2 minutes. Not because I am going to tell you something dramatic, not because I am going to sell you fear, but because something happened in the last 24 hours that the people you trust to explain the world to you have either missed entirely or chosen not to explain. And the gap between what they are saying and what is actually happening is the widest I have seen it in years. Let me take you somewhere specific. Not the Arabian Sea, not the ruins of a missile factory in southern Iran, not the press conference where an American general used calm language to describe something that was not calm at all. I want to take you to a map most people in Western countries could not find without help. The Caspian Sea, a body of water sitting between Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan. Landlocked, ancient, and until very recently treated by every major power as a zone that existed outside the logic of modern war. That changed. And what changed next, what Vladimir Putin quietly set into motion in the 60 minutes after he received the intelligence briefing about the Israeli strike on Bandar Anzali, is something that makes every analyst I respect deeply uncomfortable. Not because it is loud, not because it involves missiles or declarations, but because it is patient, calculated, and designed to hurt in places that will not show up on a satellite image. This is the full picture. My name is not important. What matters is that you understand what you are about to hear, because this is not commentary. This is the map behind the map. Subscribe now if you are not already here. Turn on notifications, because the next 72 hours are going to move fast, and I am going to be tracking every single development as it happens. Let us start with what actually happened and why the timing matters more than the strike itself. The Israeli Air Force reached deep into northern Iran and struck the port of Bandar Anzali on the Caspian coast. The official military language described destroyed corvettes, missile boats, a command center, logistics infrastructure, clean language for something with very messy consequences. And the IDF acknowledged something extraordinary in the same breath. The vessels that were destroyed did not pose a direct threat to Israeli or American forces in the combat zone. They said that out loud. Think about what that means. A military operation was conducted at enormous political cost against targets that were not shooting at anyone. That is not a standard military logic. That is a message. And messages sent through military operations are only valuable if the intended recipient understands exactly what is being said. Russia understood it within the hour. Here is the first thing almost no one in mainstream coverage is saying out loud. The port of Bandar Anzali was not functioning primarily as an Iranian military base. Yes, Iranian naval assets were docked there. Yes, missile boats were present. But what made Anzali genuinely irreplaceable was something far less visible and far more consequential. It was the southern anchor of a supply architecture that Vladimir Putin personally signed off on expanding in the autumn of 2022. A logistics corridor that moved not just weapons, but the components of weapons. Not just drones, but the targeting systems inside drones. Not just ammunition, but the technical knowledge that turns basic ammunition into precision ammunition. Russia and Iran built this corridor quietly over 36 months. They built it because they had to. Western sanctions had pushed both countries into a logistical embrace that neither had fully planned for, but both came to depend on. The Caspian became their shared bloodstream. Goods moving north, goods moving south, technology moving in both directions, financial arrangements made in currencies that avoid the dollar entirely. And Bandar Anzali was the heartbeat of that system. The port where Iranian logistics met Russian shipping in a space that felt until last week genuinely untouchable, Israel touched it anyway. And that is where this story actually begins. Because striking Anzali was not just a military decision. It was a calculation about what Russia would and would not do in response. Israeli intelligence is exceptional. They knew before the operation launched what assets were docked at Anzali. They knew the strategic significance of the port to Russian supply chains. They knew about the logistics corridor, and they made a decision that carries an enormous assumption buried inside it. They assumed that Russia would respond with words, not weapons. They assumed that the absence of a formal mutual defense treaty between Moscow and Tehran created operational space to strike Russian-adjacent infrastructure without triggering a Russian military response. That assumption may be correct in the short term, but the calculation running inside the Kremlin right now is not about the short term. Here is what happened in the 60 minutes after Putin was briefed. According to sources tracked by regional analysts and confirmed through statements from the Russian Foreign Ministry, 3 separate conversations were initiated simultaneously from Moscow. Lavrov called Tehran. The head of Russian military intelligence contacted his counterpart in the Syrian command structure. And a third communication, the one that has received almost zero attention in Western coverage, went to Baku, to Azerbaijan, a country that is not formally allied with Russia, has complicated relations with Iran, and is deeply invested in Western energy partnerships. Russia called Azerbaijan not to threaten them. Russia called Azerbaijan to remind them of something. That reminder is the story. Azerbaijan has spent the last decade carefully positioning itself as the safe middle option in a dangerous region. The Southern Gas Corridor, a pipeline carrying Azerbaijani natural gas into Europe, represents a $45 billion infrastructure investment that Europe has come to depend on as an alternative to Russian energy. The Shah Deniz offshore gas fields in the Caspian, the Sangachal terminal, the entire architecture of Azerbaijani energy exports into southern Europe runs through infrastructure that sits on or next to the Caspian Sea. And that infrastructure, as every Azerbaijani strategic planner knows, sits within reach of Iranian missile systems. Russia did not need to threaten Baku directly. Russia only needed to make clear that an unstable Caspian, a Caspian where Israeli strikes have already happened once, is a Caspian where no one can guarantee the safety of anything. Not pipelines, not terminals, not the offshore platforms that European energy security now depends on. That message landed. And Baku's public silence since the Anzali strike is not neutrality, it is controlled panic. Now let us talk about what Putin is actually planning, because this is the part that the coverage is completely missing. And missing it is not an accident. Vladimir Putin does not respond to provocations in the way that Western media frames responses. Western media looks for the symmetrical counter-move. You hit my port, I hit your something. That is not how Moscow thinks. Putin has had 25 years to develop a doctrine of response that prioritizes asymmetry, deniability, and long-time horizons. He does not respond to the move that was made. He responds to the position that the move has created. The position that Israel's Anzali strike created is this. Russia now has a legitimate grievance, documented in its own foreign ministry statements, about the safety of its commercial and strategic interests in the Caspian. Russia has publicly declared that its economic interests were directly damaged. That declaration is not emotional, it is legal and strategic groundwork. It establishes on the record that Russia is a victim of aggression in this conflict, not just a supporter of Iran, a victim. That shift in framing matters enormously because of what comes next. The first move Putin is preparing is not military, it is financial. Russia is the second largest oil producer on earth. Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. Between them, these two countries have the ability to apply pressure to global energy markets that no military operation can match for sheer economic damage. What is being discussed inside Moscow right now, what Russian energy ministry officials are modeling in real time, is a coordinated adjustment to oil production and export routing that would send crude prices to levels European economies are not positioned to absorb. Not a formal oil embargo, nothing that can be called a weapon under international law, simply a series of commercial decisions made by sovereign energy producers that happen to create a price environment deeply hostile to the economies of countries supporting Israel. Europe is the target, not militarily, economically, And Europe is extraordinarily vulnerable right now. German industrial output has been declining for 3 consecutive quarters. French fiscal positions are under pressure. The energy architecture that Europe rebuilt after the 2022 Ukraine war shock has stabilized but not fully recovered. Another energy price shock, even a moderate one, lands on a continent with very limited shock absorption capacity left. Putin knows this. He has known it for 2 years. The Anzali strike has given him the political cover to act on it without appearing to be the aggressor. The second move is already in motion, and I want you to pay close attention because this one is not speculative. It is observable if you know where to look. Russian military logistics in Syria have been quietly adjusted in the last 30 days. Resupply flights to Hmeimim Air Base in Latakia have increased. The specific cargo on those flights is not confirmed publicly, but regional monitoring groups tracking flight patterns have noted the increase. Russian air defense radar systems in Syria have undergone what military analysts are describing as a recalibration exercise. And Russian naval assets in the eastern Mediterranean have shifted positioning in ways that alter the coverage footprint of their sensor systems. None of this has been announced. None of it appears on the evening news. All of it is meaningful. What Russia is doing in Syria is not preparing for a direct confrontation with Israel. Russia is expanding its situational awareness footprint in ways that give it much better intelligence about Israeli Air Force operations in the region, better intelligence about flight paths, about operational timing, about the logistics of the Israeli air campaign against Iran. That intelligence does not stay in Russian hands. Intelligence shared with Iran improves Iranian air defense response times. It improves Hezbollah targeting. It improves the operational picture for every actor that Russia is unofficially supporting in this conflict. Russia does not need to fire a single missile to make Israeli military operations significantly more dangerous and more costly. It only needs to share what it sees. That is already happening. And the effects will show up on the battlefield in ways that will be explained as Iranian capability improvements, as Hezbollah becoming more sophisticated, as the conflict becoming more complex. The Kremlin will not take credit for any of it. They do not need to. Now, I want to spend a moment on the piece of this that is the most alarming and the most completely absent from any analysis I have read in English. And I have read all of it. There is a meeting being requested, not announced, requested. Through diplomatic back channels that run through Ankara and Doha, the 2 capitals that have maintained communication lines to all parties in this conflict simultaneously, what Iran is now asking for, quietly and urgently, is a renegotiation of the strategic partnership agreement that Russia and Iran signed in January 2025. Not a public renegotiation, a private one, with a specific addition, a mutual defense clause. 2 years ago, Iran rejected Russia's offer of a formal mutual defense treaty. The calculation was rational at the time. The liberal parliamentary faction in Tehran believed that signing a formal military alliance with Moscow would permanently close the door to any possible engagement with Western governments. They believed that Russia's informal support would continue regardless. They believed that the strategic benefits of keeping their options open outweighed the security guarantee that a formal treaty would provide. Bandar Anzali has destroyed that calculation completely. Iran has now been struck more than 12,000 times, according to regional monitoring. Its nuclear sites have been targeted. Its naval assets have been destroyed. Its oil infrastructure has been damaged. And Russia, the country that was supposed to be its strategic partner, watched all of it happen while providing unofficial support and filing strong verbal protests. The verbal protests have not stopped a single Israeli or American missile. The unofficial support has not prevented a single strike. The faction inside the Iranian parliament that rejected the Mutual Defense Treaty is now facing an impossible political argument. They said the treaty was unnecessary because Russia would protect Iran anyway. It has not. They said the treaty would close the door to Western engagement. The door is not just closed, it has been blown off its hinges by 12,000 strikes. When the Mutual Defense Treaty gets signed, and I am telling you right now on the record that it will get signed, the entire security architecture of the Middle East and Eurasia becomes something that has never existed before. A formal Russian nuclear umbrella extended over Iran, Russian obligation to treat an attack on Iranian territory as an attack on Russia, not a NATO equivalent by name, a NATO equivalent by function. And unlike NATO, this alliance will not have a democratic consensus problem. It will not have members who disagree about the terms of engagement. It will have two nuclear-armed states, one with the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth, formally committed to each other's defense. Think about what that means for every calculation Israel makes going forward. Think about what that means for American force posture in the region. Think about what that means for every country in the Middle East that has spent the last 2 decades betting on American security guarantees. The Anzali strike did not just damage an Iranian port, it may have created the precondition for the most significant military alliance to emerge in the 21st century. That is the second and third order consequence that nobody in Western mainstream coverage wants to walk through with you, because walking through it honestly leads to conclusions that make the entire current campaign look not just strategically questionable, but historically catastrophic. Let me tell you what Putin's actual next move looks like. Not the move he announces, the move he makes. Within the next 30 to 60 days, watch for Russian technical advisors to appear in Iranian air defense installations in northwestern Iran, not Russian soldiers, technical advisors. There is a legal distinction there, and Russia will use it. These advisors will be upgrading the radar integration systems of Iranian air defense networks. They will be helping Iran's existing platforms communicate with each other more effectively. They will be closing the gaps in Iranian air defense coverage that Israeli and American strikes have been exploiting. They will not be Russian forces engaging in combat. They will be Russian professionals doing technical work. The effect will be indistinguishable from Russian forces actively defending Iranian airspace. The legal cover will be entirely intact. At the same time, watch Hezbollah's missile inventory, not the number of missiles, the type. What Russia can transfer to Hezbollah without it being attributable to Russia directly is not the most advanced platform, but it does not need to be. Even the introduction of medium-range surface-to-air missile systems into Lebanon changes the air environment over northern Israel fundamentally. It means Israeli aircraft operating over Lebanese territory face a threat they have not previously faced at any meaningful scale. It means the operational cost of supporting ground operations in northern Israel increases significantly. It means that the air superiority that Israel has treated as a given in this conflict becomes something that has to be earned, contested, and paid for in ways that a military already under strategic pressure is not well positioned to absorb. None of this will be announced in a press conference. None of it will be described as a Russian response to the Anzali strike. It will simply appear. And the Western media will cover each individual development as an isolated story. Hezbollah got more sophisticated. Iran improved its air defense. Northern Israel is becoming more contested. Each story told separately, the thread connecting all of them back to a single decision made in Moscow after a 60-minute intelligence briefing about an Israeli strike on a Caspian port will not be in the headline, but you will know the thread because you are watching it now. I want to be honest about something that I think is important to say clearly. This analysis is not an argument for any side in this conflict. It is not a defense of Russian strategy or Iranian policy or Israeli military decisions. What it is an attempt to see the full picture at a moment when the full picture is the most valuable thing available to anyone trying to understand where this goes next. And where this goes next is not good. Not for anyone. Israel is a country with extraordinary military capability and genuine security needs that are real and legitimate. But it is operating in a conflict that has expanded far beyond the parameters that even its strongest supporters were comfortable with 3 months ago. The original objectives were clear: prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, destroy the infrastructure that was being used to attack Israeli territory. These are defensible strategic goals. What the conflict has become is a multi-theater campaign involving the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, the Indian Ocean, and now the Caspian Sea, with a country that has more nuclear warheads than any other nation on Earth, watching its strategic interests get damaged and making quiet preparations to respond in ways that do not require a press conference. That is not a strategy for achieving defined objectives. That is the shape of a campaign that has lost its boundaries. The United States is the only actor with the leverage to change this trajectory. Washington has the ability to tell Tel Aviv that the Caspian is a line that cannot be crossed again, not because of sympathy for Iran or Russia, but because the second and third order consequences of Russia formally entering this conflict, even indirectly, even through the mechanisms I have described, create a security environment in the Middle East that American forces in the region would then have to navigate. And American military planners do not want to navigate an environment where Russian technical expertise is actively improving the systems that are targeting American assets. The question is whether that pressure gets applied before the next Caspian strike or after it. History is not encouraging on this point. Here is where I leave you today. Not with false hope, not with manufactured optimism, but with three questions that I genuinely want your thoughts on in the comments, because this is the kind of analysis that gets sharper when real people bring real perspectives to it. The first question: if Russia begins transferring air defense technology to Hezbollah inside the next 60 days, does the responsibility for what happens over northern Israeli airspace belong to Moscow, which made the transfer, or Tel Aviv, which struck Anzali and created the political conditions for Moscow to make the transfer? The second question: the mutual defense treaty that Iran rejected 2 years ago and is now preparing to reconsider, if it gets signed, does it make the region more stable because clear red lines exist, or less stable because every future conflict now carries nuclear escalation risk? The third question: when this conflict eventually ends, and all conflicts eventually end, which country will history judge as having most expanded its strategic position, and which will history judge as having most damaged its own long-term security by winning battles that cost more than the wins were worth? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the actual questions that the next 5 years are going to answer whether we are ready or not. At Daily Brief, we do not cover the surface. We cover the architecture underneath the surface, the decisions being made in rooms that do not have press access, the calculations that show up 3 months later as facts on the ground that everyone acts surprised by. The Anzali strike is in that category. What comes next from Moscow is in that category. And we are going to be here every single day, tracking it as it develops, explaining it clearly, connecting the threads that the mainstream coverage leaves hanging. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Share this with someone who is trying to understand what is actually happening and cannot find an explanation that goes deeper than the headline. Come back tomorrow. Because Putin's next move is not going to announce itself with a statement. It is going to appear quietly in a radar system, in a logistics flight, in a conversation that gets reported 3 months from now as background context to something else entirely. We will see it when it happens. We will explain exactly what it means. And we will remember together that the path to that moment ran through the Caspian Sea, through a port called Bandar Anzali, through a decision that someone signed off on, without fully accounting for the patience of the man sitting in Moscow who does not respond to the move. He responds to the position. And the position right now is one that gives Vladimir Putin more options than he has had at any point since this conflict began. That is not a comfortable conclusion, but it is the honest one. And honest is the only thing worth being when the stakes are this high.